Hello, and welcome back to Storytime with Eric Zimmer. Where we last left off in Chocolate Fever, Henry Green started to get little brown spots not only on his arm, but all over his body. I wonder what will happen next. So you ready? Alright, let's begin. Chapter 4. Pop! Dirt breeds germs, Nurse Molly Farthing would often say, and germs have a nasty way of making healthy people ill. Naturally, the infirmary of PS 123 was always spotless because Nurse Molly Farthing wouldn't have it any other way. And naturally, as Mrs. Kimmelfarber and Henry rushed through the door that morning, she made both of them go back and wipe their feet on the mat. "And don't bring any of your cocoa in here," Nurse Farthing added. She sniffed the air loudly. "Cocoa?" said Mrs. Kimmelfarber. "Don't think I don't smell it," Nurse Farthing said. "Please, Nurse Farthing," said Mrs. Kimmelfarber, "we have an emergency on our hands. This is Henry's Green. He's breaking out in a rash of some sort." "So I see," said Nurse Farthing. She sat Henry down in a chair and turned on a bright light. Pushing her spectacles down to the tip of her nose, she bent close to Henry and looked him over. "It's a rash, all right," she said at last. "Peculiar. Looks like little brown spots all over." "Exactly," Mrs. Kimmelfarber said. "But what is it?" "Have you ever had measles?" Nurse Farthing asked. "Yes," said Henry, "when I was 5. "Chicken pox?" "When I was 3.5. "Then I would say you have an unidentified rash. And frankly, I don't like the look of it." Henry, who up until now was merely frightened, began to feel terrified. Nurse Farthing laid her cool hand on his arm and steadied him. There, dear," she said. "Nothing to be frightened of. I'm sure it's not serious. How do you feel?" "Not good," said Henry. "Warm? No. Cold? No. Dizzy? No," said Henry. "I just feel strange." "You poor dear," said Nurse Molly Farthing. You really must be frightened." She ran her fingers through his hair and patted the back of Henry's neck. Somehow this made him feel a little better. "Pop!" "Did you say something?" said Nurse Farthing. "No, ma'am," said Henry. "Pop!" "What is that noise, then?" she asked. "It sounds like something going pop." "I heard it too," said Henry. "So did I," said Mrs. Kimmelfarber. "Pop, pop, pop!" Now they all heard it. The sound of popping filled the infirmary. Little pops and bigger pops and poppity-pop-pops kept popping. Henry looked at his arm and in an instant knew where the noise was coming from. His little brown spots were growing bigger and bigger. They were popping out all over him. No longer the size of freckles. They were as big as the chocolate bits his mother used for making cakes and cookies. He could feel them popping out on his arms and face and could feel them growing under his shirt. In less time than it takes to tell it, Henry Green was covered with little brown lumps from the top of his head to the tip of his toes. Jesus. Chapter 5. Calling Dr. Fargo. In later years, Henry couldn't remember who screamed first. All he could recall was that both he and Mrs. Kimmelfarber were yelling their heads off, and that Nurse Molly Farthing was as cool as a cantaloupe. "Calm down now, both of you," she said. "Mrs. Kimmelfarber, you go and call Mrs. Green on the telephone. Tell her we're taking Henry to the city hospital." Mrs. Kimmelfarber didn't move. She just stood there with her mouth open, staring at Henry. "You scoot now," insisted Nurse Farthing in a stern tone. "Shush! Off with you! And you, Henry Green," she said as Mrs. Kimmelfarber left the room, "are coming with me. Let us go. Quietly. Calmly." She took his hand, and once again Henry noticed that it felt good and somehow made him feel better. He kept holding her cool hand as they left the school. All the way to the hospital, as the taxi sped along, Henry held fast to the calm, steady hand of Nurse Molly Farthing. In fact, it wasn't until he had been checked by 2 different doctors and was waiting to be examined by the hospital's chief of children's medicine, Dr. Fargo, that he dared to let go. What? What? Said Dr. Fargo as he came bounding into the examining room. He was a small, round man with a bushy white mustache and a confused look on his face. What have we have here, eh? He asked. Boy looks like he fell in a mud puddle. He leaned down so close to Henry's nose that Henry could smell his puffy breath. It smelled like peppermints. Didn't fall in a mud puddle, did you, lad? No, sir. Didn't think so, said Dr. Fargo. Too bad. Would have explained what those big brown spots all over you. Well then, he said, turning to Nurse Molly Farthing, tell me things. You're not going to believe this, Doctor, Nurse Farthing began as she told Dr. Fargo about the events this morning. I am not going to believe this, Dr. Fargo repeated when she finished. It's impossible. No rash in the whole history of rashes ever appeared so fast, or grew so big, or popped out with a noise you could hear. Impossible. It happened, said Nurse Farthing. So I see. Well, we'll soon get to the bottom of this, or my name's not a... What is my name, by the way? Dr. Fargo, I believe, said Henry. Pleased to meet you, son, said Dr. Fargo, and he shook Henry's hand. Ought to do something about those big brown spots, though. Yes, sir, said Henry, who was beginning to feel confused himself. Dr. Fargo took Henry to the examining table and switched on the big lamp. For a full 5 minutes he said nothing but and ha as he poked and prodded Henry. He looked at every big brown spot and all the bare spots in between the big round spots. He looked with a magnifying glass and without a magnifying glass. In Henry's eyes and ears and nose and even under his tongue. Finally, he said, I don't know any more than when I started. They look just like your typical big brown spots, except, of course, in the whole history of the civilized world, there has never been a case of big brown spots before. I'm frightened, said Henry. I'm Dr. Fargo, said the doctor. That much I know. Now, what I'd like to do is get to know more about those brown spots of yours. He wet the tip of a cotton swab and brushed it gently against one of the big brown spots on Henry's right arm. Ouch, said Henry. Did that hurt? No. Then why did you say ouch? Because, said Henry, I thought it was going to hurt. So I see, said Dr. Fargo, shaking his head. He put the cotton swab into a glass jar. Take this to the laboratory at once, he said to one of his assistants, and the man rushed out of the room. In a few minutes we'll know more about these big brown spots of yours, the doctor said. Hands behind his back, he began to pace the room. Suddenly he stopped, his nose in the air. Who has been eating a candy bar in my office? He demanded. No one answered. Dr. Fargo's nose twitched from side to side as he sniffed the air. I smell candy, he said. Someone's been eating a candy bar. Just then the telephone rang, and Dr. Fargo bounded across the room to answer it. What? What? He said into the phone. Are you sure? His mustache bounced up and down as Dr. Fargo sank slowly into a chair. He put the telephone down and with a look of amazement on his face, Chocolate, he said. Those big brown spots are pure chocolate. Chocolate? Gasped Nurse Farthing. Chocolate, exclaimed Henry. Chocolate, echoed Dr. Farthing's two assistants. Exactly, said Dr. Fargo. The boy, it seems, is nothing more than a walking candy bar. Chapter 6. Catch that boy. There was more excitement than Henry had ever seen. All kinds of doctors were examining him now, poking and prodding as if he were not a boy but a pincushion. And Dr. Fargo was bounding about the room, talking about chocolate fever, a new disease, making medical history and things like that. Henry was tired and afraid. He wanted to be left alone. He wanted all the doctors to go away. He wanted to be home. He wanted, in fact, to be just about any place in the world except this hospital. So he did something very simple, something his heart told him he had to do to survive. He jumped off the examining table and began to run. In a flash he had bolted through the doorway and was running down the long corridor. Behind him, he heard shouts of, "Stop! And catch that boy!" Two nurses at the end of the corridor tried to catch him, but Henry was simply too quick. He dodged past them and darted down the stairways. Down, down, down he went, down 3 whole flights of stairs and out into the main lobby of the hospital. Ahead of him, a guard at the door held out an arm. Running as hard as he could, Henry crashed through his grasp and into the street. Without pausing to think where he was headed, Henry ran. He was about to turn the corner. As he was about to turn the corner, he looked back. There was a whole army of people pursuing him. Doctors in white coats, nurses, guards blowing whistles, policemen waving their arms, and behind them he could see Dr. Fargo. Henry didn't want to see any more. "Legs," he said, "don't turn me now." And with that, he turned the corner and took off down the street. He ran and ran until he had no breath left. And then he ran some more. His legs flashing in the afternoon sun, Henry darted down the street and up another. He had no idea of where he was. He had no idea of where he was going, but he still kept running. People stared at him as he went by. A few even raised their hands as if to stop him or say something, but Henry kept on running. After a long period, he couldn't see or hear any of the people running after him. I must be far ahead of them by now, Henry thought. But suddenly up ahead at a corner, a police car flashed by with its siren screaming. "They must be after me," he thought with alarm. "I'm a wanted man." Sick at heart, Henry pushed himself to run faster. His head hurt, his side hurt, his legs hurt, but he kept running. His lungs hurt, his eye hurt, even his hair began to hurt. But Henry kept running. At last he could run no more. He was finished. Done. He had to rest, and to rest he had to hide. Without thinking about it, Henry ran down a large grassy alley that lay between 2 white houses. At the end of the alley was a large garage with one door partly open. Henry sneaked in and looked around. There was an automobile parked inside, but not a person in sight. With his last bit of strength, he flopped down on the floor beside the automobile. "A fine mess you're in now," he thought. "You've run away from a hospital, the police are after you, your mother must be scared to death with worry, and you have a disease no one has ever heard of before." The more he thought about his predicament, the sadder Henry became. A lump rose in his throat, a tear ran down his cheek, a sob escaped from his lips, and he was crying, sobbing out loud, really crying. He cried for a few moments because he was so sad. He cried some more because he was lost. And then he cried for a long, long time because everything had become so hopeless. At last, when he could cry no more, Henry dried his eyes and started to think out of his situation. He would not go back to Dr. Fargo in the hospital. Of that